prayed to the Lord that he would turn Ahithophel's known wisdom into foolishness. And it will, as we're going to see, and in fact, his advice will be that of so unhinged when all is said and done. And we're also just going to see the reality of the darkness of political warfare has not changed really over the last millennia. Rhetoric and mental sickness and hatred will fuel division among some people who were turned very hateful in all of this unfolding. So let me just give a recap here. Absalom has declared himself to be king. He has aligned political allies alongside of him, as well as unsuspecting confidants into David who were caught unaware of the treason that was really unfolding. And so David then is forced to flee the palace, where he leaves 10 of his concubines back behind, and but is joined alongside of really an interesting array of supporters, and some of them of which are foreigners who recognize that God's hand is still on his leadership even in the crisis. And so in acts of brilliance then, we also, just as this recap, David sent some of his men back to the ranks of Absalom to pose as supporters when they are going to be really become his eyes and ears of what's going on in the ground, his son's behavior, who will then come back and report to what has been happening. And so let's jump into this wild turn today as matters that begin with someone that we've been introduced to actually a few chapters earlier, a man named Ziba, who was a servant of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth happened to be, just as a recollection, he was the crippled son of Jonathan, that after Jonathan and all of the Saul dynasty were, for the most part, were all killed, David honored him by bringing him, Mephibosheth, back to his table, allowed him to sit among his sons there, almost like family, and before that they were his family before they were killed. And so Ziba is about to really turn a stunning turn of events here. So let's open up with verse 1. When David had gone a little beyond the summit of the Mount of Olives, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, was waiting there for him, and he had 2 donkeys loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 bunches of summer fruit, and a wineskin full of wine. Well, what are these for? The king asked Ziba. And he replied, well, the donkeys are for the king's people to ride on, and the bread and summer fruit are for young men to eat, and the wine is for those who have become exhausted in the wilderness. And so, well, where's Mephibosheth? Saul's grandson, the king asked him. He stayed in Jerusalem, Ziba replied. Today I will, just a moment, I'm sorry. Staying in Jerusalem, Ziba replied. He said, today I will get back the kingdom of my grandfather Saul. Well, in that case, the king said to Ziba, I will give everything Mephibosheth owns, to you. Well, I bow before you, Ziba replied. May I always be pleasing to you, the Lord my king. Now, it seems, we'll stop there a moment. It seems slightly off to begin with that Ziba just happens to be at the right place at the right time, and also with just a plethora of food. A coincidence? No, not necessarily, but it's time of great need for David and all that were traveling with him. And so Ziba appears, he's given this appearance that he's very generous and that he's helpful with the gifts he brought. And yet this is where it begins to even get dicey, because Ziba spoke of his master Mephibosheth, who was not there, first of all, to defend himself, stating that he was actually back in Jerusalem and he was waiting for David to be completely overthrown and Absalom for them to ruin all and turn on one another. And so Ziba goes as far as to state that Mephibosheth was longing to restore the family of Saul to his reign. And none of this makes sense. And although this is groundwork that will really be a larger reveal in chapter 19, a couple more chapters down, the truth of the matter was that this is a bold, outright lie that Ziba is telling. In actuality, what we're going to learn is that Ziba left Mephibosheth behind in order to make it appear that he did not support David. And this would really be that of a red herring. The report at its face value would have been shocking and no doubt stunningly disappointing. David had bent over backwards for this crippled son, the only remaining male that was known of that of Saul's dynasty. And David had sought him out, and he had brought him into the palace and let him sit there with all of his other sons, treating Mephibosheth with respect. And not only this, he had actually gifted the land back to Mephibosheth, which is being talked about here, that had been part of his family. This report would have hurt David greatly, not only because of the words spoken, but also the hurt of really hearing that another friend of his had turned against him. Ziba is this just despicable individual who used shameless and senseless slander in order to gain something for himself. And what was he getting for himself? Well, he just was handed the land, and while doing so, brought even more sorrow to David's heart. Was that part of what this was going on? And David had done nothing but been so generously kind to Mephibosheth. And unfortunately for David, he acted on what little information he was given, and assumed, why would he not assume that Ziba was telling the truth right there, and rewarded then such loyalty by giving everything that had been Mephibosheth to him. And this was exactly, you see, what Ziba wanted. He wanted to use this crisis for his own benefit. Sadly, we've all experienced such disappointment. There are people who come and go into our lives, and they will use whatever they can for their own prosperity or what they get out of it. They mislead, they lie, they gaslight, and sadly, many times these who act like this, then they kind of know exactly when to pounce. And then it tends to hit us when we're floundering. It just kind of hits us at that time that we're low, and they say things that are so devastating because we may be struggling with something in life, and it just adds to that distress. And the simple lesson is really to just consider in the very brief introduction of this chapter is there is so much to really just say about kind of stepping back and processing something before we take action or we make a decision. Like, there is such wisdom in not reacting, which is so hard. We're very reactionary people. But reacting to something that was said to us that may put the person speaking to us even in a better light than what actually went down. And I'm not blaming David here. David's just had his entire world turned upside down, and he's been forced to flee Jerusalem because the very son wants him killed. And let's be reminded here, he's lost advisors and people that he so trusted in his government that have been turncoats. And once again, David, many years later, is living back on the run, just scrounging even for a place to lay his head. And even all of the troops and the men that were with him, and then there was families with them. He was looking out for all of these people. And now he couldn't do it here, but the best thing to do is really to seek out the truth from others and investigate before making any form of a decision as to what we would do. But David's been hit hard, and let me just say, he's about to be hit with a second encounter with a distant clan member next of Saul that will overrun his heart with turmoil. And so verse 5, as King David came to Barim, a man came out of the village cursing him. And it was Shimei, son of Gera, and the same clown, I keep wanting to say clown, the same clan, well, he is a clown, the same clan as Saul's family, and he threw stones at the king and the king's officers and all the mighty warriors who surrounded him. "Get out of here, you murderer, you scoundrel," he shouted. The Lord is paying you back for all the bloodshed in Saul's clan. You stole his throne, and now the Lord has given it to your son Absalom, and at last you will taste some of your own medicine, for you are a murderer. Man, it just seems to go from bad to worse for David. Shimei was this distant relative to former King Saul who still resented, obviously, David for replacing Saul after all of these years. And his hatred toward David had not eased, but it had just grown and it had festered. And he's about as offensive, really, as a person could be, cursing continuously at them, throwing stones, making horrific, might I add, inaccurate statements against David. Let me tell you, there are always people that are ready to rejoice when a leader falls. Always. Shimei had this heart against David for a very long time, but would only show it when David was down and out. And the audacity of Shimei's statement, with a quick look of how things had turned for David, seemed to confirm these statements. But Shimei was wrong. You see, none of this came upon David because of what he did to Saul or Saul's family. David had actually treated Saul and his family with such great love and with graciousness, even though he could have been justified to do the opposite, especially after all of the years that David had been on the run in the wilderness while Saul was out to kill him. And David may have been a man of war, but he was not bloodthirsty. But it was Saul and not David that brought it was Saul and not David that brought his own family to ruin. Because Saul and his delusions and madness and his jealousy, and let's not forget the reality that the Lord had turned himself against Saul when he refused to be obedient, all the way back when Samuel was the prophet and instructed him that they needed to have worship before they went into war, and Saul belligerently neglected and just did what he wanted, and this was his downfall. Not only had he lost the lead of God in his life, but from that moment on, he was really on that of a mission of self-destruction with no safety net from the Lord. I'm going to tell you, when people rejoice over another's demise, there is no God in their lives. I said it. There is not. People who claim to be followers of Jesus and yet rejoice over someone else's failures, rejoice over their struggle when they come out throwing swings at things in their life of what may even be half-truths even, they're pretty despicable individuals. And this is nothing more, in my opinion, than demonic actions that the enemy does so well to divide and conquer. Let me remind each of us today, as followers of Christ Jesus, and are doing the best we can to live for him in this insane world, let me remind us of this. If there's any encouragement from belonging to Christ, if there's any comfort from his love, any fellowship together with the Spirit, are your hearts tender and compassionate? Then make me truly happy by agreeing wholeheartedly with each other, loving one another, working together with one mind, one purpose. Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out for your own interest, but take that interest in others too. You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. There it is. We as Christ followers are to have the same attitude that Christ had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave. He was born a human being, and when he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God, and he died a criminal's death on the cross. Therefore, God elevated him in the place of the highest honor. He gave him the name above all other names, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue declare that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Let me tell you, folks, let me just remind all of us here this day that the calling of God upon our lives is higher. It is fuller. It is bolder than even really how we're living today. Paul's words, which I think are some of the most beautiful penned, call us to have hearts that are tender and compassionate, and he commissions us as followers to love one another and to work together with the same person. Look, this isn't about getting what we want and making sure that our voice is heard about over every other one, but that is acting in living in first and foremost death to ourselves. If we are claiming to follow Jesus, this is that first order of business. Dying to our sinful nature, and as we know it needs to happen, we know it. It needs to happen every single day. And beyond this, comparing to what are the attitudes that I have today that really should be like living in humility? How am I doing with that? What about having obedience? What about being purposeful? Our attitudes, this is what's really going on here, our attitudes seeking those things. Are we indeed serving others, even if they're our enemies? The world, and yes, even followers in name only, have gotten it wrong, because today it is so much about my rights, my will, what I want. Jesus made it crystal clear. You want to follow me? Then okay. Pick up your cross and die. That's about it. And yet the demonic behavior of Shimei is just as prevalent today. It's not gone away. If anything, it's amped up and it's turned it on its head. And let me just say, Jesus is nowhere to be seen in such behavior. Nowhere. In our current era, most of us, we can't even scroll through social media feed without being offended by something, right? David's behavior showed that he was humble. David somehow, just let's translate today to David's response, David somehow was able to become content, to allow God to sort out the details. Are we allowing God to sort such details out with whatever it is that we may not agree with? David didn't need to take matters into his own hands, because in the end, we're going to see he fully trusted the Lord, that the Lord would be the one to defend him. And so what is our response when this happens? Well, although I think it appears as David is simply just passing this off, there's truth to take in how we can learn to respond. And so, verse 9. Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Abishai, son of Zeruiah, demanded. Let me go and cut off his head. No, the king said. Who asked for your opinion? I think that's hilarious, you sons of Zeruiah. If the Lord has told him to curse me, who are you to stop it? Then David said to Abishai and all the servants, my own son is trying to kill me. Doesn't this relative of Saul have even more reason to do so? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to do it. And perhaps the Lord will see that I'm being wronged and will bless me because of these curses today. So David and his men continued down the road, and Shimei kept at pace with them, on their nearby hillside, cursing and throwing stones and dirt at David. So crazy. And the king and all who were with him grew weary along the way, and so they rested when they reached the Jordan River. David here receives this adversity with humility. Although Abishai wants to deal with it immediately, remember, David is surrounded. Let's just remember, he's completely surrounded by all these mighty men of valor that had been with him from the beginning, who are more than able to take this weak man down. But David's response is really shocking. It's let him. Just let him. Well, what in the world does that mean? David, you see, was willing to hear what God might say to him through this cursing critic. Ironically, much different than even Shimei's accusations of being a bloodthirsty man, because if David was, he would have had him killed right then. How could David do this? How? Because David had come to this point in his relationship with God that he chose to see the hand of God in every circumstance, even when the circumstances were atrocious. Because he knew that God, in his timing, would deal with this man, so David didn't need to give an order. Nothing short than he put this Shimei problem, you see, in perspective. And in reality, Shimei wasn't the problem, Absalom was, which he reminds his troops. And beyond this, David knew that God's hand was on the very future for his life as well as the present. He knew that he hadn't done anything wrong. He stood in that. He had done right in this situation, and God would take care of his future. And in David refusing to cling to the throne, he really is much like what we read of Jesus here in Philippians. He took on the form of a servant, David did. He humbled himself, even to death. He was laying himself down like, well, whatever happens, happens on the horizon if God didn't intervene. And which this reason alone may be possibly one of the reasons that David was called a man after God's own heart, even through all of the turmoils and the sinful behavior that he had at times, because he always would return to walking in humility before the Lord. And it's such a beautiful illustration of the deep inward peace that God gives to us when we're living in fellowship, even as everything is falling down around us, and we're pursuing his motive and desires. And beautifully, God allowed comfort. We read here in that last little verse to finally find David, as this portion of the story says that they were able to finally rest on this weary road that they traveled, and God refreshed him there, as some translations actually say, that he was refreshed there by the Lord. David was able to find hope and comfort, even if it was the small things, as he sat beside that river. And how was this? Because David was in peace, because he knew that above all, God was in control of all of Israel, not some person. Folks, where are we finding the peace that we need every day? What is the measurement of our peace? Many times, situations, they don't change. We know this. Many times, turmoil is heavy. How are we able? How are you able? How am I able to find peace there? Because we need to. The fact of the matter is, no matter what is happening around us, folks, I just want to remind you, if you're in this mess right now of something, God's still in control of that situation for you. He is. He's still in control, even when it doesn't look like it. So we've covered David, so let's get an update. It's what's going on in the enemy's camp, because it's pretty wild. Verse 15. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the army of Israel arrived in Jerusalem, accompanied by Ahithophel. And when David's friend Hushai, the Archite, arrived, he went immediately to see Absalom. "Long live the king," he exclaimed. "Long live the king." "This is the way you treat your friend David?" Absalom asked him. "Why aren't you with him?" "Well, I'm here because I belong to the man who is chosen by the Lord and by all of Israel," Hushai replied. "And anyway, why shouldn't I serve you? Just as I did your father. I was your father's advisor. Now I'll be your advisor." So let's pause here. Let's remember. Hushai, if you look back to a couple weeks ago when we looked at that, Hushai the Archite, he wanted to desperately, he pleaded to stay with David as he was on the run. But David said, "No, it's far better for you to go into the camp, become a spy within the court of Absalom, and he will trust you." And Hushai was that man that was set for this. And his sole purpose in all of this was to observe, yes, all of the decisions being made, but also to possibly give some bad advice. Absalom, you see, had gotten so much in the way of any clear thought of that more of his father's guys were defecting rather than question it. He just wasn't questioning it. And so with his true motives hidden, Hushai is immediately ushered into this inner circle. And here's where we now get to this insanely atrocious advice that Ahithophel is about to give. And this guy's bitterness and his hatred toward David has now fully festered with sickness. It is sick, as he suggests some of the worst, vile behavior imaginable. So then Absalom, verse 20, turned to Ahithophel and asked him, "Well, what should I do next?" Ahithophel told him, "Go and sleep with your father's concubines, for he has left them here to look after the palace. And then all Israel will know that you've insulted your father beyond any hope of support, of reconciliation, and they will throw their support to you." So they set up a tent on the palace roof where everyone could see, and Absalom went in and had sex with his father's concubines. And Absalom followed Ahithophel's advice, just as David had done. And for every word that Ahithophel spoke seemed as wise as though it had come directly from the mouth of God. Truly, there are no words for this portion of this story. But what's the real motive of what's going on here? Why would he suggest something so offensive? Well, if Absalom did as Ahithophel suggested, which obviously he did, it would certainly ruin, first of all, any form of possible reconciliation with his father in the future. That's over now. This would also make a very strong statement to the people that had turned and were following Absalom that would give them courage. Well, then I'm just going to do whatever I want and I'll have the support. Now, in reality, in ancient world, taking a king's concubine was not only an act of immorality, it was viewed as an act of treason. This was also a way for Absalom to not only replace David, but actually just reject his father completely. And Ahithophel, what does he gain through such radical advice? Well, it's all about self-interest, as we're kind of seeing in this pattern of these three interactions today. Ahithophel had everything to lose if Absalom failed to keep the throne. And he'd be viewed then, if David came back, as a traitor and sentenced to death. And he had made this bold decision to turn against David, and now he would go all in with whatever ends as possible to keep it. But it also speaks, and there's a couple other things going on here. It does speak to Absalom's character, which wasn't very good. He actually did what was suggested. Absalom, he has no character. And then there's the character of Ahithophel, who no doubt gained some sick satisfaction of watching David's women be violated in a similar way, here's the point, to what had happened to who? His granddaughter, Bathsheba. Because let's remember, she was actually his granddaughter. And this had boiled and boiled within him. And what this shows is what the power of bitterness does. Because Ahithophel at this point is now willing to see innocent women abused. Absalom sinned terribly, and the kingdom of Israel suffered greatly, all to simply satisfy Ahithophel's hunger for revenge. When bitterness begins to grow in our hearts, it will turn us unrecognizable to others who knew us when we were better. Bitterness corrupts our character. It may at one point have been good. And it will turn even our best qualities sour. Now, as a matter of God keeping his promise, what takes place here is actually a fulfillment that the Lord God had given to punishment for David for his sin with Bathsheba. Let's take a look back at that. This is what the Lord says. Because of what you've done, I will cause your own household to rebel against you. So now we've got Absalom. It's already in full rebellion. I will give your wives to another man before your very eyes, and he will bed them in public view. Amazing, right? You did it secretly. I will make this happen to you openly in the sight of all Israel. You see, God kept his word to his prediction and then remarkably honored David. So God kept his word, but take a look. He honored David's prayer for the foolishness to take precedent and Ahithophel's advice, which was not only foolish, it was destructive. And Absalom, strangely, he thought he could establish his kingdom through immorality. He may have even been clever and a skilled politician, but he was very ignorant to the ways of God. And so, as always, when we kind of come to a close of just a strange chapter, and there's a lot of strangeness going on here, what's our takeaways? Well, the devastation that David is hit with here it just seems never ending. He's manipulated by one man. He's cursed by another. His own son rides into Jerusalem, taking all of David's, making it his own, and going as far as the remaining concubines left there, violates them publicly. And here we have then life on the run. We see David almost resigned to the pain, kind of how it feels. And in the middle of all this heartache and unwritten soul searching, that I want to go back to that verse of 14, which just spoke of David quietly gaining strength. And although it doesn't speak of his seeking God there, it doesn't say that, there's no doubt to me that this was where his strength for the next day and the next would be found, with watching and hearing and enduring such tumultuous upheaval. The only thing that was steady for David was coming back to the very God he loved and trusting the very God he loved, even in the horror, as everything was disintegrating right before his eyes. And maybe you feel this way at the moment. Our eyes on the tangible of difficulty that bombards, which hits every aspect of our ways. And then there's the torpedoes of discouragement that just seem to be coming unendingly towards us. And sometimes the only way we're going to find the strength to even go, as we're standing in that wreckage of where we're at, is from the strength that only God can provide. Even while we're still in the road of our misery And maybe that is where you're at today. It's been unending. I want to remind, He refreshes. He will refresh our soul, and He will draw our perspective back to Him. And sometimes, yes, that is moment by moment. And there's been times from my own life that it's been like almost second by second that I've had to just really continue to renew my mind and my hope in Him, as the tangible of what I see unfolding around me is devastation and there is no hope. I have had to return to Him in those moments over and over again to get the perspective that I need. Weary and heavy from continuing to endure, He will bring a peace to us in the middle of all that could be happening. And so with these thoughts, I've asked Justin to come and lead us now in communion as we kind of digest some of this.